What you're about to hear will change the way you look at the ocean forever. 5 fishermen, 5 impossible encounters, 5 secrets the sea should have kept buried. This isn't fiction. These are the documented accounts of men who went out on ordinary fishing runs and came back changed, if they came back at all. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some waters aren't meant to be fished, and some distress calls should never be answered. This is the true dark horror of the Pacific Northwest, where the ocean remembers everything, and some debts are never paid. Story 1. The Driftwood Queen. Amos Keen spent 30 years working the waters off the Washington coast. 30 years of knowing every inlet, every current, every secret the ocean was willing to share. But on November 14, 1996, the ocean showed him a secret it had kept hidden for nearly 40 years. A secret that still calls out through the fog, still rings its bell from impossible depths, still broadcasts its final moments on a loop that never ends. The fog came fast that night, too fast. One moment Amos could see the distant lights of Near Bay's harbour, faint pinpricks marking safety and home. The next moment there was nothing but grey opacity pressing against his wheelhouse windows like something solid, something alive, something that wanted in. Amos had seen fog before. 30 years on these waters meant you learned to navigate blind, learn to trust your instruments when your eyes betrayed you. But this fog was different. It had weight, it had presence. And somewhere in its depths, a bell was ringing. 9:47 p.m. Amos noted the time because he was meticulous, because details mattered when you worked water that was always trying to kill you. The bell came from his starboard bow, steady and rhythmic, exactly like a channel marker should sound. Except there was no channel marker at these coordinates. There had never been a channel marker here. The bell rang with mechanical precision, not the irregular clang of metal responding to waves, but measured intervals, exact timing, like something counting down to an event that had already happened decades ago. Then the radio crackled to life. A man's voice, tight with panic, desperate with fear, coordinates, a vessel name, the Driftwood Queen, taking on water, lost power, need immediate assistance. The transmission ended mid-sentence, cut off like someone had dropped the microphone, or like the ocean had finally claimed what it had been hunting. Amos grabbed his microphone, his hands steady despite the ice forming in his gut. He responded immediately, identified his vessel, confirmed reception, requested the Driftwood Queen maintain contact. The radio hissed, static, nothing more, just the soft sound of emptiness where a human voice should be. He called the Coast Guard. Young operator, uncertain voice, probably new to the job. She confirmed she'd received his transmission, would initiate search and rescue. Then she said something that made Amos's blood crystallize in his veins. There was no vessel named Driftwood Queen in their database. No ship by that name had filed a float plan out of any Washington port in the past 6 months. According to their records, the Driftwood Queen didn't exist, but someone had just called for help. Someone was dying out there in the fog, and Amos had their coordinates. He turned his boat into the grey wall of fog, into the sound of that impossible bell, into water that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. The ocean was too calm. No swell, no wind-driven chop, just flat water that reflected nothing, because there was no light to reflect. The bell grew louder as he approached the coordinates, much louder, close enough that he should be able to see whatever was making that sound. But there was nothing, just fog and flat water, and that mechanical ringing that came from depths where no bell should exist. Then shapes materialized from the grey, massive, dark, motionless. Amos's spotlight swept across wood that showed extensive rot, metal fittings hanging loose, wheelhouse windows empty as skull sockets. An old fishing vessel, very old, sitting dead in the water with no lights, no movement, no signs of life. The name on the bow was faded but legible in the spotlight's glare. Driftwood Queen. Lettering from another era, carefully crafted in a style modern vessels never used. Amos reported his finding to the Coast Guard. The operator asked him to repeat, her skepticism clear, even through the radio static. He described the derelict in detail, the condition, the name, everything that suggested this vessel had been in the water for years, possibly decades. The operator told him to stand by. The minutes stretched like hours while Amos kept his spotlight trained on the ghost ship, while the bell continued its impossible ringing, while the fog pressed closer and the night grew colder and wronger with each passing second. When the operator returned, she asked if he felt comfortable boarding to check for survivors. Amos didn't feel comfortable at all. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, to put distance between himself and this thing that shouldn't exist. But if someone was alive on that wreck, he had a moral obligation. The deck was slick with decay, wood threatening to give way beneath his boots with each careful step. The wheelhouse interior was ruins, water damage everywhere. Radio equipment corroded beyond any possibility of function. This equipment hadn't worked in many years. It couldn't have transmitted the distress call he'd heard less than an hour ago. Below deck, the smell was overwhelming. Salt water and mildew and something else, something that made his stomach turn and his primitive brain scream warnings his conscious mind tried to ignore. He found the logbook in a corner, partially hidden under debris. Water-damaged leather cover falling apart in his hands. The final entry was, dated October 12, 1957. Captain R. Braddock reporting unusual fog conditions, radio malfunctioning, taking on water, breach in the hull they couldn't locate, visibility 0. The entry ended with coordinates, the exact coordinates Amos had received in the distress call. Below that final entry, in different handwriting, desperate and hurried, 3 words that would haunt Amos for the rest of his life. The bell won't stop. Amos climbed back to his vessel, moving faster now, not caring about the dangerous deck, just needing to be away from this place where time had folded in on itself. He secured his boarding ladder and backed away, watching the Driftwood Queen fade into the fog like it was sinking back into whatever dimension it had emerged from. Before he could report, another transmission came through. The same voice, the same panic, the same coordinates, the same desperate plea for help. Word for word identical to the first call, even down to the sudden cut-off mid-sentence. The Coast Guard operator came on immediately. She'd heard it too, but their radio direction finding equipment showed the transmission was coming from Amos's exact position. According to their instruments, he was broadcasting the distress call, not receiving it. The bell started ringing again, louder than before, directly beneath his boat now, coming from 180 feet of water, far too deep for any channel marker. Amos engaged his engines and ran. The distress call repeated, again. Every few minutes, like a recording stuck in an endless loop, like the final moments of the Driftwood Queen playing over and over for anyone who came close enough to hear. The fog thinned as he approached the coast. By the time he reached Near Bay Harbor, visibility was nearly normal. The bell had stopped, or he'd moved out of range. Either way, the silence felt like a gift he didn't deserve. The harbour master met him at his slip. She took one look at his face and asked if he'd seen a ghost. Amos tried to explain, his words disjointed and confused, his mind still processing impossibilities. The Coast Guard investigator's name was Lieutenant Rook. He listened with careful neutrality, then pulled out a file and opened it between them. The file contained reports and photographs of the fishing vessel Driftwood Queen, which had disappeared October 12, 1957, while returning to Near Bay. Captain Rufus Braddock had radioed a distress call giving coordinates, and reporting his vessel was taking on water. Search and rescue found nothing. The case was closed with the assumption the vessel sank in deep water, crew lost. Rook explained that the Coast Guard received reports of distress calls from the Driftwood Queen 3 to 4 times per year, always during heavy fog, always the same coordinates, always ending the same way. Radio direction finding consistently showed the source at those coordinates 8 miles offshore. Multiple vessels had responded over the years. No one had ever found anything except empty ocean. Amos was the first person to report actually seeing the derelict vessel. Rook closed the file, looked at Amos with professional skepticism mixed with something that might have been fear. The official position was atmospheric anomaly, old radio signals reflected and rebroadcast by unusual weather conditions. Amos asked about the bell. Rook's expression changed, became guarded. He asked what bell Amos was referring. When Amos described it, the precise rhythm, the source from deep water, Rook was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted other mariners had reported hearing a bell in that area. Always during fog, always with that same wrong rhythm. There was no bellboy at those coordinates. There had never been one. Yet people heard it ringing from depths where no marker could possibly be anchored. The Coast Guard had sent divers down on 2 separate occasions. They found nothing but empty ocean floor. The logbook Amos retrieved from the derelict disappeared from the Coast Guard evidence locker during winter of 1997. Lieutenant Rook reported the file room had been reorganized, several older case files misplaced during the process. But Amos suspected a different explanation. Someone decided the physical evidence needed to vanish so the official explanation of atmospheric anomalies could be maintained. Years passed. Amos continued working the waters off Washington, continued making his living from an ocean he understood less with each passing season. He heard occasional reports of other fishermen encountering the fog, the distress calls, but no one else reported seeing the derelict itself. Perhaps the Driftwood Queen only appeared to those who came looking at exactly the right time. Or perhaps Amos had seen something meant to remain hidden. He never went back to find out. On quiet nights when fog rolled in from the Pacific and blanketed the harbor in thick grey silence, Amos would stand on his deck and listen. Underneath the normal harbor sounds, if he listened carefully enough, he could hear something else. A bell ringing in perfect mechanical rhythm from somewhere out beyond the harbor entrance. The sound would fade as night progressed, growing fainter and more distant, but never quite disappearing completely. Amos would stand and listen until cold drove him below, wondering if Captain Braddock could hear that bell too, wondering if it called to him the way it called to Amos, wondering if the sound was a warning or a summons, or simply the sea's way of reminding those who worked its surface that some debts were never paid and some voyages never truly ended. Story 2. The Green Dory. The storm hit the Oregon coast on March 23, 1998, with ferocity that made veteran weather forecasters look like amateurs. Silas Marrow had fished out of Bandon Harbor for 42 years. He knew enough to respect the ocean's capacity for violence. When the forecast called for sustained winds above 50 knots and seas reaching 20 feet, Silas secured his boat and stayed ashore, watching from his hillside house as the Pacific reminded humanity exactly how small and fragile its presence really was. The wind howled through Bandon streets like something alive and furious. Rain fell in sheets so thick, visibility dropped to nothing. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of broken trees, torn roofs, power lines down, and debris scattered across every surface. Silas made his way to the harbor as soon as roads were passable. His boat, the Persistent, had weathered the storm well. some chafing on dock lines, torn fender, nothing serious. Other fishermen weren't so fortunate. 2 boats driven against the breakwater, several smaller vessels swamped at their slips. The harbour was littered with broken crab pots and torn planking. Ira Pendry, Coast Guard rescue swimmer stationed at Bandon, spotted the Dory while conducting beach surveys south of the harbour. He radioed Silas, knowing Silas had lived there long enough to recognize local boats. The Dory was perhaps 12 feet long, painted faded green with white gunnels, the kind of small working boat fishermen used for tending nets close to shore. But Silas didn't recognize it, and that was wrong because he knew every Dory that operated out of Bandon. The boat was in remarkable condition considering it had just been through a major storm. Paint weathered but intact, no signs of recent damage, seats firmly attached, oarlocks present and functional, no water inside the hull. It appeared to have been set down carefully rather than thrown there by violent waves. What caught Silas's attention was what lay inside. Resting on the center seat was a waterproof notebook, wet on the surface, but when Silas opened it, he found the pages completely blank. Not a single entry, not a mark, just pristine white pages that had never been written on. Beneath the notebook, carved into the wood of the seat itself, were marks that made Silas's skin prickle. Someone had used a knife to scratch symbols into the wood, deep gouges that looked fresh despite the weathered condition of the boat. The symbols weren't words in any language Silas recognized, but they had deliberate quality, suggesting meaning and purpose. 3 rows, 5 or 6 marks each, carved with considerable force and determination. The wood around each symbol showed stress fractures like whoever made them had been pressing down with barely controlled violence. Ira asked if Silas recognized the boat. He didn't. The style was old-fashioned, might have been built 50 years ago, but the condition suggested recent use. No registration number, no name, nothing to identify owner or origin. The oars were missing, which meant if someone had been in the Dory when it was cast adrift, they would have had no way to control direction or fight the waves. About 200 yards south of where the Dory washed up, Silas found something that made him call out to Ira. A life jacket tangled in kelp at the tide line, one of the old cork-filled types, not commonly used since the 1970s. The jacket was torn, not from age, but from what looked like deliberate cuts, as though someone had taken a knife and slashed through canvas and cork, filling in multiple places. The jacket straps were still buckled, suggesting it had been worn by someone who then cut themselves out rather than simply unbuckling normally. The cuts were clean and purposeful, made by someone who wanted to remove the jacket quickly, but who had been precise enough not to cut themselves in the process. Silas pointed out something else that bothered him. The life jacket had washed up south of the Dory, which meant it had been carried by current moving opposite to what storm patterns should have produced. The prevailing current ran south to north. Storm surge might temporarily reverse that flow, but the jacket's position suggested it had been traveling against both normal current and the direction the storm should have pushed it. Coast Guard Lieutenant Torres arrived an hour later. He photographed the Dory from multiple angles, documented the carved symbols, collected the blank notebook as evidence, arranged for transport to the Coast Guard station. He said he'd work to identify the owner and determine whether anyone had been aboard when it was lost. Silas asked about the symbols. Torres said he'd have them analyzed, but admitted they didn't match any distress signals or maritime communication codes he was familiar with. Something about the situation bothered Silas in ways he couldn't articulate. The boat's condition was wrong for something that had been through that storm. The blank notebook made no sense. The symbols looked desperate and urgent, but if someone had time to carve messages, why hadn't they radioed for help or fired flares? On his third visit to the beach 4 days after the storm, Silas found footprints. They were in sand protected from tide, by an outcropping of rock, preserved because no water had reached them since they'd been made. The prints were bare feet, relatively small, possibly a woman's or young person's. They emerged from the waterline and walked up the beach toward the dunes, then simply stopped. No indication the person had turned around or walked in a different direction. The prints just ended in the middle of the beach, as though whoever had been making them simply ceased to exist. Silas photographed them and followed their path back to where they emerged from the tide line. He stood at that spot, looking out at the ocean, trying to imagine what would cause someone to walk out of the water, cross the beach, then vanish. That night, Silas stopped by the diner where Nellie Hartwell had been serving food to fishermen for as long as anyone could remember. He described the Dory and circumstances of discovery, asked if Nellie had ever heard of anything similar. Nellie was quiet for a moment, refilling his coffee, organizing her thoughts. Finally, she asked if the Dory had been painted green with white trim. When Silas confirmed, Nellie nodded and told him he should talk to old Tom Mersham, who lived in a cabin up in the hills. Silas found Mersham's cabin the following afternoon. Tom was in his 80s, retired fisherman who had worked these waters since the 1940s. He listened to Silas's description with increasingly grave expression. Tom went to a closet and pulled out an old photograph album, flipped through yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for. The photograph showed a young man standing next to a dory, his hand resting on green painted gunwale. Tom explained the man was his younger brother Marcus, who had disappeared in 1954 while fishing alone in that same dory. Marcus went out early one July morning to check his gill nets. He never returned. Search found nothing. Official conclusion was he'd been swept out to sea. Tom had never accepted that explanation. Marcus was too experienced to make fatal mistakes. The weather that day had been calm and clear. Tom believed something else happened, something that couldn't be explained by normal maritime accidents. Silas asked about the symbols. Tom's expression changed, became even more troubled. He asked Silas to describe them in detail. When Silas did, Tom reached for paper and pencil and drew symbols from memory, marks that matched exactly what Silas had seen carved into the dory's seat. Tom explained these symbols had appeared in various places around Bandon over the years. Carved into driftwood, scratched into rock faces near water, drawn in sand at the tide line. No one knew what they meant or who was making them. The local historical society had documented them, theorizing they might be indigenous markings or code used by early settlers, but no definitive explanation was ever established. Tom had his own theory. He believed the marks were a warning or perhaps a cry for help from people who had been taken by the ocean and who were trying to communicate with those who remained on shore. The dory washing up decades after Marcus Mersham's disappearance made no sense. Wood deteriorates, especially in salt water. The boat should have been long gone, broken apart and consumed, yet it appeared in near-perfect condition as though preserved by something or someone who wanted it found. The blank notebook suggested whoever had last been in the dory hadn't had time to write, or perhaps hadn't wanted to leave a record of what was happening. The carved symbols were desperate and violent, made by someone terrified or furious or both. The Coast Guard investigation concluded 2 weeks later with findings that satisfied no one. They determined the dory was of a type commonly built in Oregon during the 1950s, consistent with Tom Mersham's identification. They couldn't explain how it survived 60 years in the ocean, couldn't explain the blank notebook or carved symbols. The official report noted these anomalies, but offered no theories about significance. The dory was stored in a warehouse with other unclaimed marine property. The symbols were photographed and documented, but Coast Guard linguists and code specialists could provide no translation or identification of origin. Silas continued fishing. but found himself paying attention to things he'd previously dismissed. He began noticing areas where current seemed to flow in directions contradicting what he knew. He observed fish behavior that puzzled him. Salmon swimming against normal migration routes, halibut appearing in depths where they shouldn't be found. He heard stories from other fishermen about encounters with phenomena that couldn't be explained. Equipment malfunctions without mechanical cause, sounds heard underwater that didn't match any known marine source. The ocean, Silas realized, was far stranger than he'd allowed himself to believe during decades of working its surface. On quiet mornings when sea was calm and fog lay thick, Silas would sometimes see things at visibility's edge that made him question whether his eyes were reliable. Shapes that might be boats or might be something else entirely. Movement beneath the surface too large to be any fish he knew. Lights that appeared and disappeared with no obvious source. Tom Mersham told Silas the ocean had its own rules that didn't always align with human understanding. Sometimes the best response to mystery was acceptance rather than explanation. The footprints were washed away by next high tide, disappearing as though they'd never existed. Silas returned several times hoping to find them again or find new ones, but the sand remained unmarked except for bird tracks and occasional beach walkers. He thought often about those prints, about someone walking out of water and then vanishing, about where they might have gone and whether they'd intended to leave or been taken against their will. There was something profoundly wrong about footprints that simply stopped, about evidence of presence that ended without explanation. Tom Mersham died in 2003, taking with him whatever theories he'd never fully shared. New fishermen came to Bandon, young people who hadn't known Marcus Mersham or heard the stories about strange symbols and impossible currents. But Silas remembered. He remembered the blank notebook and carved symbols and life jacket deliberately cut apart. He remembered footprints leading nowhere and the Dory that survived decades when it should have been reduced to splinters and rot. Every March 23rd, anniversary of the storm that brought the Dory back, Silas would walk down to the beach where it had been found and stand looking at the water. He'd think about Marcus Mersham, who went to check his net 60 years ago and never returned. He'd think about all the other people taken by this ocean, all the fishermen and sailors who slipped beneath waves and disappeared into depths that kept their secrets. He'd think about the possibility that some of them hadn't drowned, hadn't died, but had instead been taken somewhere else. Somewhere that existed in relation to the ocean but wasn't quite part of the world Silas knew. And he'd wonder if the carved symbols were directions, a map to a place where the missing went. A place that occasionally sent back evidence of its existence in the form of green painted dories that shouldn't still exist and footprints that ended in empty sand. Story 3. The Waterproof Bag. Thaddeus Pike had been pulling crab pots off the Northern California coast for 38 years when December of 2001 brought weather that made even veteran fishermen nervous. The season had been good, Dungeness crab, running in quantities Thaddeus hadn't seen in over a decade. But the forecast for December's second week showed storms stacking up across the Pacific like freight trains waiting to slam into the coast. Most of the Eureka fleet decided to wait out the weather. Thaddeus considered doing the same, but he had 200 pots in the water. Leaving them during major storms meant risking losing them to shifting currents or having them buried when swells stirred up the bottom. He made the decision to do one more run, pulling his gear and storing it safely until weather cleared. He left harbour at dawn, his boat, the Mary Catherine, cutting through swells already building as the first storm approached. Wind from the southwest, gusting to 30 knots. Sky that peculiar grey-green quality Thaddeus associated with nasty weather systems. His deckhand, Billy Cormack, helped check the hydraulics on the pot puller, made sure the deck was clear and ready. They had 200 pots to retrieve, which would take most of the day, even if everything went smoothly. Thaddeus wanted to be back in harbour well before dark, before the worst arrived and turned uncomfortable swells into something genuinely dangerous. The first 180 pots came up without incident, each one heavy with crab that filled the hold with promise of profitable trip. Billy worked efficiently, clearing pots, rebaiting them, stacking them on deck while Thaddeus manoeuvred between marker buoys. They were pulling pot 183 when the winch caught on something that resisted being hauled to surface. Thaddeus increased power to the hydraulics, assuming the pot had snagged on bottom structure, gotten tangled in kelp. The winch strained against resistance. For a moment, Thaddeus considered cutting the line rather than risking equipment damage. Then whatever was holding the pot released suddenly and the line came up fast, bringing not just the crab pot, but something else, tangled in its lines. Billy called out in surprise as additional weight became visible at the rail. Wrapped around the pot's frame was a length of chain, heavily corroded and covered in marine growth, clearly man-made and substantial. The chain was perhaps 20 feet long, with links thick enough to have been used for anchoring a large vessel. Both ends were broken, not cut, but snapped, showing bright metal where failure had occurred. Thaddeus helped Billy bring the pot aboard. They carefully unwrapped the chain, laying it out on deck to examine. The corrosion suggested years in the water, possibly decades, but the broken ends looked fresh, minimal oxidation on exposed metal. Attached to one end of the chain, still secured by corroded shackle, was something that made both men stop and stare. A waterproof bag, military surplus type, made of heavy rubber with seal that appeared intact, despite obvious age. The bag was perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, bulging with whatever contents it contained. Thaddeus felt immediate and powerful reluctance to open it. Something about its presence on the end of that chain, something about the way it had come up tangled in his crab pot, felt wrong in ways he couldn't rationally explain. Billy, younger and less burdened by superstition, reached for the bag before Thaddeus could stop him. The seal opened easily, rubber still flexible enough to function properly. Billy looked inside and his expression changed from curiosity to confusion to something that might have been fear. Inside were documents, sheaves of paper protected by plastic sleeves, all covered in handwriting that looked hurried and cramped. Photographs as well, dozens of them showing what appeared to be a fishing vessel and its crew. Billy pulled out one document sleeve and held it up. The handwriting was difficult to read, rendered in pencil that had faded but was still legible if you looked carefully. Thaddeus took the sleeve and moved closer to deck lights, trying to make sense of what he was reading. The text appeared to be some kind of log or journal with dates starting April 1986, continuing through what looked like early June that same year. The entries described fishing operations, catch reports, weather conditions, all normal contents of a ship's log. But there were other entries interspersed with routine notations, entries describing incidents and observations that made no sense. One entry from May 3, 1986, described the crew seeing lights beneath their boat during a night set, lights that moved in formation and seemed to be ascending from deep water. The entry noted depth sounder showed bottom at 400 feet, but the lights appeared to be rising from considerably deeper, from depths beyond equipment range. Another entry from May 12th described their radar showing a contact that maintained position alongside their vessel for more than an hour, matching course and speed perfectly. But when they looked, there was nothing visible on the water. A third entry from May 18th described crab pots coming up empty, repeatedly in an area that should have been productive, noted, bait showed no signs of having been disturbed, as though no marine life had been present in the vicinity at all. The final entry was dated June 2nd, 1986. The handwriting was nearly illegible, as though written by someone whose hands were shaking badly. It described the crew seeing something in the water during evening retrieval, something large enough to create displacement wave that rocked their boat despite being more than 50 yards away. The entry stated whatever they'd seen was not a whale, was not any known marine animal, was something that moved in a way that defied normal biology. The writer noted they'd all agreed to stop fishing this area immediately to pull remaining gear and return to port, that they were securing this log and other documentation in a waterproof bag, which they would attach to a marked buoy so that if something happened to them, there would be a record. The entry ended with coordinates and a statement that whoever found this bag should avoid these waters at all costs. Thaddeus looked at Billy, who had gone pale despite cold wind. Thaddeus asked if the photographs showed anything useful. Billy pulled them out and spread them on the deck housing. Most images showed exactly what you'd expect from fishing vessel documentation. Crew members at work, the boat from various angles, catches being processed. But several photographs showed something else. In 3 images visible in the water near the boat was a dark shape just below surface. The shape was indistinct due to water refraction and camera limitations, but it appeared to be roughly cylindrical, perhaps 30 feet long, completely smooth with no visible fins or natural features. In one photograph taken from the boat's stern, looking back at its wake, the shape was breaching slightly, showing what might have been a head or forward section unlike anything Thaddeus had ever seen on any marine animal. Billy asked what they should do with the bag and contents. Thaddeus's first instinct was to throw it back overboard, reattach it to the chain, let it sink back into whatever depth it had been resting at for 15 years. Something about the journal entries and photographs made him want nothing to do with whatever the crew of that unknown vessel had encountered. But he also recognized this was potential evidence of maritime incident, possibly disaster. If the crew who wrote those entries had disappeared, if their vessel had been lost, this bag might be the only record of what happened. Thaddeus made the decision to secure the bag, finish pulling his pots, report the find to Coast Guard when they returned to port. The remaining 17 pots came up normally, but Thaddeus noticed something that made him increasingly uneasy. His depth sounder was showing readings that fluctuated in ways that made no sense. Bottom depth would show 400 feet, then drop to 600, then return to 400, all while the boat remained in essentially the same location. The sounder showed these variations even though charts indicated this area should have relatively consistent bottom depth. Thaddeus checked GPS coordinates, confirmed he was exactly where he should be, pulling pots from locations where he'd fished for decades. The depth variations made no sense unless something was moving beneath the boat, something large enough to affect what the sounder interpreted as bottom returns. Billy called out from the stern, his voice tight with tension. Thaddeus looked back and saw what had caught Billy's attention. The water behind the boat was moving strangely. Not just normal wake patterns, but something else. A disturbance rising from below, creating a bulge on the surface. The bulge was perhaps 40 feet across, moving slowly alongside the boat at depth that kept it almost completely submerged. Thaddeus could see hints of something solid underneath, glimpses of dark surface that caught light in a way that didn't look natural. He reached for throttle and increased speed, wanting to put distance between Mary Catherine and whatever was pacing them. The bulge kept pace effortlessly, matching their speed without any visible means of propulsion. No fins breaking surface, no splash of tail flukes, just smooth, impossible movement. Thaddeus turned toward harbor entrance, abandoning the last few pots, focusing entirely on getting back to shore as quickly as possible. The bulge followed for perhaps 10 minutes, maintaining position off starboard quarter. Then it simply sank and disappeared. depth sounder readings returned to normal. Water behind the boat showed nothing but ordinary wake patterns. Billy and Thaddeus looked at each other without speaking, both understanding they'd just experienced something they wouldn't be able to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it themselves. Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer Eldon Rook had been with the service 26 years and heard just about every kind of strange story fishermen could tell. Thaddeus laid out the waterproof bag on Rook's desk, explained where it came from, what he'd found inside. Rook examined contents with professional interest, making notes, taking photographs. When Thaddeus mentioned depth sounder anomalies and the disturbance in water, Rook's expression became more guarded. He asked specific questions about size and behavior of what Thaddeus had seen, about water temperature readings, about whether there had been any marine mammals in the area. Thaddeus answered as accurately as he could, emphasizing what he'd observed didn't match any whale or shark or other known animal. Rook was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a file drawer and pulled out a folder that looked well used, its contents thick with reports and documents. He explained the Coast Guard had been documenting unusual marine sightings along this section of coast for more than 30 years. Most could be explained as misidentified known species or natural phenomena that appeared strange under certain light conditions. But there were a small number of reports that defied easy explanation, reports describing encounters with something that behaved in ways inconsistent with known marine biology. The coordinates Thaddeus had pulled his pots from were in an area that had generated more than its share of these reports. Several fishing vessels had reported equipment malfunctions in that area, unusual sonar readings, unexpected encounters with something large their crews couldn't identify. Thaddeus asked if any vessels had been lost in that area. Rook consulted his file and confirmed that in June 1986, a fishing boat named Catherine Louise failed to return to port. The vessel had been working crab grounds approximately 12 miles offshore when it simply disappeared. No distress call received, extensive search and rescue found no wreckage, no survivors, no bodies. The Catherine Louise carried a crew of 4. Coast Guard investigation eventually concluded the vessel probably was overwhelmed by rogue wave or suffered catastrophic structural failure that caused it to sink quickly. The case was closed as presumed loss at sea, one of several dozen fishing vessels that disappeared off California coast during that decade. Thaddeus asked about the vessel captain's name. Rook checked the file and provided it. When Thaddeus returned to his boat, he went through documents from the waterproof bag again, this time looking for any identification. He found it in one photograph, clear image of wheelhouse showing vessel name painted on equipment in the background. Catherine Louise. The documents he'd found came from the lost boat. The journal entries describing strange lights and radar contacts and something moving in the water had been written by a crew who knew they were experiencing something dangerous, something that might cost them their lives. Over following weeks, Thaddeus found himself thinking constantly about those journal entries and what they implied. The crew of Catherine Louise had documented multiple encounters with phenomena they couldn't explain, had recognized they were in danger, had taken time to secure a record before whatever had been hunting them finally caught up. Thaddeus wondered what those final hours had been like, whether the crew tried to flee or were taken by surprise, whether they understood what was happening, or whether the end came too quickly for comprehension. He thought about the waterproof bag secured to chain and thrown overboard, a message in a bottle meant to warn others, desperate attempt to leave evidence of something most people would never believe. He thought about his radar and what it had shown him during that last set of pots. His equipment was calibrated and properly maintained, checked regularly by technicians who understood navigation systems. Yet for nearly an hour his radar had shown nothing in an area where something large and solid had clearly been present. Catherine Louise's crew had reported the same phenomenon. Contacts that should have been visible but weren't, objects that appeared on radar but couldn't be seen visually. It suggested whatever inhabited those waters had some way of affecting electronic systems, of making itself invisible to instruments humans relied on to navigate and hunt. The area where Thaddeus pulled the pot with attached chain became known among Eureka fishermen as the kelp line, though there was no actual kelp bed there. The name came from the way oceans seemed to change at that particular latitude, from the way water looked different, darker somehow, even on bright days. Fishermen who worked near the kelp line reported equipment problems with unusual frequency, depth sounders giving inconsistent readings, GPS units showing positions slightly off from where they should be, radios picking up interference from sources that couldn't be identified. Some fishermen avoided the area entirely, choosing to work grounds that were less productive but felt safer, less wrong. Others continued fishing there but did so with heightened awareness, watching the water for signs of disturbance, listening to equipment for anomalies that might indicate something unusual was present. Cora Bell Fenwick, who managed dock operations at Eureka Marina, began keeping track of which boats reported problems after working near Kelp Line. She maintained unofficial log noting dates and times and specific types of equipment failures. Over 5 years, she documented more than 40 incidents she categorized as anomalous, events reporting fishermen couldn't explain through normal mechanical failure or user error. Cora showed her log to Thaddeus one afternoon, asking his opinion about patterns she thought she might be seeing. Thaddeus looked through her careful notations and confirmed what Cora suspected. The incidents clustered around specific moon phases, occurring most frequently during new moons when night was darkest and visibility minimal. They also occurred more often during winter months when fishing pressure was heavy and more boats were working those waters. Thaddeus asked if she'd shown her log to anyone official, anyone who might investigate properly. Cora said she'd tried, but her reports had been dismissed as superstition or coincidence. The Coast Guard was willing to document unusual incidents when reported, but they weren't going to launch investigations based on patterns that might simply be statistical clustering. Equipment failures happened, Cora had been told. Sometimes those failures happened in the same area simply because that was where fishing activity was concentrated. The idea that something in water might be deliberately affecting vessels and their systems was not something that would be seriously considered without much more concrete evidence. The waterproof bag and contents remained in Coast Guard custody, catalogued as evidence in Catherine Louise' investigation that had been reopened based on Thaddeus's discovery. The documents were analyzed by experts who confirmed handwriting matched samples from the vessel's captain, that photographs had been taken with camera type consistent with what would have been available in 1986. The image showing underwater shape was examined by marine biologists who could provide no definitive identification. Some suggested it might be large shark photographed under conditions that distorted its appearance. Others noted features that didn't match any known shark species and declined to offer theories about what else it might be. Official finding was that image showed unidentified object or organism and that further analysis would be required to reach conclusions. Thaddeus continued fishing off Northern California for several more years, but he never worked the kelp line again. He'd lost 20 crab pots in that area, abandoning them when he chose to return to port early rather than complete retrieval. The economic loss was significant, but Thaddeus considered it reasonable price for avoiding whatever inhabited those waters. He heard occasional reports from other fishermen who claimed to have seen something unusual near Kelp Line. Descriptions of lights below surface, of movements that seemed too large and too purposeful to be explained by known marine life. None of these fishermen reported their observations officially, knowing such reports would either be dismissed or lead to scrutiny and questions they didn't want to answer. On quiet days, when harbour was calm and boat work was finished, Thaddeus would sometimes sit on Mary Catherine's deck and look out at the ocean, thinking about what lay beneath that surface. He thought about the crew of Catherine Louise, who had seen something that terrified them enough to secure documentation in waterproof bag and throw it overboard in hopes someone would find their warning. He thought about depth sounder readings that showed moving bottom, about the bulge in water that paced his boat with intelligence and deliberate intent. He thought about all the other fishing vessels that had disappeared over the years, boats that simply failed to return to port with no wreckage ever found, no explanation ever established. Most of those losses were attributed to storms or rogue waves or general hazards of working on ocean that was always dangerous. But Thaddeus wondered how many of those lost boats had encountered something else, something that lived in deep water and that occasionally came to surface to hunt. The kelp line remains today, an area some fishermen work and others avoid, a section of ocean that looks the same as any other but carries with it accumulated weight of stories and warnings. The crabs there are plentiful, the fishing grounds productive, and on calm days you'd never guess anything unusual inhabited those waters. But Thaddeus knows better. And so do the other fishermen who've worked there long enough to notice the patterns, to see the evidence that something lurks beneath the surface. They don't talk about it openly, don't share their theories with researchers or Coast Guard investigators. They simply remember the warnings from Catherine Louise's crew, written in shaking handwriting and preserved in waterproof bag that waited 15 years to be found. They remember and they are careful and they watch the water with eyes that have learned to see what most people miss. Story 4. When Stars Lie. Jasper Sloan first noticed the discrepancy on a Tuesday night in late October 2003 during what should have been routine squid run out of Moss Landing. He'd been fishing these waters for 29 years, knew current patterns the way other people knew their daily commutes, trusted his instruments the way a pilot trusts his gauges, even when visibility is zero. The night was moonless and calm, conditions perfect for attracting squid to bright lights commercial fishermen used to concentrate catches. Jasper's boat, the night hauler, was equipped with light system powerful enough to turn darkness into artificial day across 100-yard radius of ocean surface. The currents along this section of Central California coast were well documented, studied by marine scientists and oceanographers who mapped every eddy and flow with precision that could predict conditions weeks in advance. The tide book showed current should be running south at approximately 1 knot, slow but steady flow that would carry the boat gently in that direction while Jasper worked his nets. But when he checked GPS position after first set, he found Night Hauler had drifted nearly 2 miles north, directly against what the current should have been doing. Jasper checked his instruments thinking there might be malfunction in GPS receiver. The coordinates were clear and accurate, confirmed by visual reference to coastal landmarks visible through his binoculars. The boat had definitely moved north, not south. He consulted Tidebook again, wondering if he'd misread tables or made error in calculating timing. Everything indicated current should be flowing south, yet his boat was demonstrating conclusively that water was moving north instead. Jasper radioed Hattie Lavelle, marine meteorologist who provided forecasting services to Moss Landing fishing fleet from office in Monterey. Hattie was a woman who took her data seriously, who understood accurate information about ocean conditions could mean difference between successful trip and disaster. She listened to Jasper's report and asked him to confirm his position and direction of drift. When he did, there was long pause before she responded. She told Jasper current observations from other sources were confirming predicted southward flow, that she was seeing data from buoys and other vessels that all indicated normal conditions. Jasper's position was the only anomaly. Hattie suggested he might be experiencing local eddy, temporary circular flow that could create conditions opposite to prevailing current. Such eddies were rare but not unknown in this area, usually associated with underwater topography that disrupted normal flow patterns. Jasper accepted this explanation but remained uneasy. He'd fished through eddies before and they had characteristic feel, circular motion, easy to recognize once you knew what to sense. What he was experiencing felt different, a straight, steady flow in direction that contradicted everything he understood about these waters. He completed first set and brought catch aboard, several tons of market squid that filled his holds with promise of profitable night. He prepared for second set, repositioning boat and lowering nets again. As he worked, he became aware of sound that seemed to be coming from his engine, faint whistling note that rose and fell in pitch like wind moving through narrow opening. Jasper went below to engine room thinking perhaps gasket was failing or fitting had worked loose. He checked everything carefully but could find no mechanical source for the sound. Engine was running smoothly, all systems within normal parameters. Yet the whistling continued, faint but persistent. When Jasper returned to Wheelhouse, he noticed something else that made his unease deepen into something closer to fear. The lighthouse at Point Pinos, which marked southern entrance to Monterey Bay, was flashing its signal with timing that seemed off. Jasper had been watching that lighthouse for nearly 3 decades. He knew its rhythm as well as he knew his own heartbeat, could identify it in darkest conditions by counting interval between flashes. The light flashed every 10 seconds, pattern so reliable, navigation charts listed it as one of most dependable aids along this section of coast. But tonight the light was flashing at 9 seconds. Jasper timed it carefully with his watch, counting multiple cycles to confirm what he was seeing. 9 seconds consistently, the light operating full second faster than it should be. He grabbed radio and called Coast Guard station at Monterey, reporting timing anomaly. The watch officer who responded sounded skeptical but agreed to check with lighthouse keepers. Several minutes later, officer returned to report lighthouse equipment was functioning normally, operating at precisely 10 seconds per cycle as it had for past 80 years. Jasper insisted he was seeing 9-second intervals, that he'd timed it multiple times to confirm. Officer suggested atmospheric conditions might be affecting his perception, that refraction could create optical illusions that made timing appear different than it actually was. Jasper knew this explanation was nonsense. He wasn't seeing refraction. He was watching a light flash and measuring interval between flashes with reliable watch. But he also recognized arguing further would accomplish nothing. He thanked the officer and ended transmission. Second net set produced another good catch, but when Jasper checked position afterward, he found boat had drifted north again, this time nearly 3 miles against supposed current. The wind was calm, barely 5 knots from west, not enough to push boat of this size that distance in time he'd been working. Jasper studied his charts, looking for any underwater features that might explain what was happening. Bottom topography in this area was relatively flat, no major canyons or ridges that would create unusual current patterns. Depth was consistent at around 200 feet, well within range where normal coastal currents should dominate. There was no rational reason for water to be flowing north with strength required to move his boat this far against predicted current direction. Jasper decided to test current directly. He deployed drift buoy, simple float attached to weighted line that would show him exactly which direction surface water was moving. He watched the buoy for several minutes, expecting it to drift south as tide tables indicated. The buoy remained nearly stationary, moving only slightly in response to wind and wave action. There was no evidence of any current at all, neither south as predicted nor north as his drift indicated. It was as though water itself was perfectly still. Yet somehow his boat was being transported steadily northward by force that didn't register on any of his instruments or observations. The engine whistling grew louder as night progressed. Jasper went below 3 more times to search for its source, becoming increasingly frustrated as each inspection revealed nothing wrong. Sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through hull in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint. By midnight, Jasper had completed 4 sets and was preparing for 5th when whistling suddenly stopped. The silence that replaced it was so complete, Jasper actually felt relieved for a moment, thinking whatever had been causing sound had finally resolved itself. Then he noticed temperature gauge for his engine cooling system. Reading was fluctuating wildly, jumping from normal operating range to dangerously high and back again in cycles that lasted only seconds. Jasper reduced power immediately and watched the gauge, trying to determine if fluctuations represented actual problem or instrument malfunction. Engine temperature felt normal when he put his hand against housing, none of excessive heat that would accompany overheating. Yet gauge continued its erratic display, showing conditions that should have shut engine down but which didn't seem to correspond to reality. Jasper made decision to head back to port. He had good catch already in his holds, and cumulative effect of all these anomalies was making him nervous in a way decades of experience couldn't dismiss. Something was wrong tonight. Wrong in ways that transcended simple equipment malfunction or unusual weather patterns. He turned night hauler toward Moss Landing and engaged cruise speed, expecting run of about 45 minutes to reach harbor entrance. As he settled into pilot's chair and adjusted course, he noticed something that made his skin crawl with immediate and profound unease. The stars were wrong. Jasper wasn't an astronomer, but 30 years of night fishing had given him intimate familiarity with constellations visible from these waters during different seasons. He could identify major star patterns without effort, use them for rough navigation checks when instruments failed. The stars he was seeing tonight were not arranged correctly. Orion, which should be rising in east at this time of year, was instead setting in west. Big Dipper, visible to north, appeared rotated from its normal orientation. It was as though entire sky had been reversed or reflected, creating mirror image of what should be there. Jasper grabbed his binoculars and studied stars more carefully, thinking his night-adapted eyes might be playing tricks. The longer he looked, the more certain he became that what he was seeing was impossible. Stars didn't rearrange themselves. Constellations were fixed patterns that remained constant over timescales measured in millennia, not minutes. He checked his compass and found another impossibility. Compass was showing north was 45 degrees off from where it should be, indicating his boat was heading northwest when all his other instruments showed southeasterly course toward harbor. He tapped compass housing thinking card might be stuck, but it moved freely in response to his touch. Reading remained steady at this new, wrong direction. Jasper looked at GPS, which showed him on course and heading correctly toward Moss Landing. He looked at stars, which told him he was heading wrong direction. He looked at compass, which told him something different from both. 3 separate sources of navigational information, all contradicting each other, all showing him different versions of where he was and where he was going. Point Pinos lighthouse flashed again. Jasper counted interval. 7 seconds. Timing had decreased again, light now operating faster than he'd observed earlier. Jasper felt panic beginning to build in his chest, tightness that made breathing difficult. He grabbed radio and called Hattie Lavelle again, describing everything that was happening, hearing his own voice rise in pitch as he struggled to remain calm. Hattie listened to his report, and her response was carefully controlled, tone of someone dealing with person in crisis. She told Jasper his stress level might be causing him to misinterpret normal conditions, that fatigue and anxiety could create perceptual distortions. She strongly suggested he continue toward harbor and that she would meet him there with medical personnel who could evaluate his condition. Jasper ended transmission without responding. He understood what Hattie thought was happening, that she believed he was experiencing some kind of breakdown or medical emergency. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps stars and compass and lighthouse timing were all being filtered through brain that was malfunctioning, creating impossible observations from perfectly normal inputs. But Jasper didn't feel confused or disoriented. His thinking was clear, his observations systematic and carefully confirmed. If he was hallucinating, then hallucinations were remarkably consistent and detailed. The alternative was that something was genuinely wrong with ocean tonight, that physical laws governing current and navigation and even celestial mechanics were being violated in ways Jasper's instruments couldn't adequately measure or explain. Engine temperature gauge suddenly locked at maximum reading and alarm began to sound, shrill and insistent. Jasper reduced power to idle, expecting engine to seize or shut down. Instead, it continued running smoothly, sound and vibration completely normal. Jasper opened engine room door and descended to check conditions directly. Engine was not hot. He could place his hand on block without discomfort. Cooling system was flowing properly, water circulating through heat exchanger as designed. Alarm was indicating emergency that didn't exist, warning him of damage that hadn't occurred. Jasper shut off alarm and returned to wheelhouse, his hands shaking badly enough that he had to grip wheel to steady them. Lighthouse flashed again. 5 seconds. Interval had decreased to half its correct timing. Light now operating at speed that should have been impossible for mechanism that controlled it. Jasper stared at the light, watching it flash with mechanical precision at this new wrong rate. He thought about lighthouse keepers who were probably sitting in their station, completely unaware their light was malfunctioning, trusting their instruments and timers while actual output betrayed their expectations. Or perhaps they knew. Perhaps they were watching their gauges show 10-second intervals while light outside flashed every 5 seconds, and they were experiencing same cognitive dissonance Jasper was feeling, same inability to reconcile what their instruments said with what their eyes observed. Harbour entrance came into view, marked by familiar jetty lights Jasper had used to guide himself home thousands of times. He increased power and turned toward channel, preparing to navigate narrow entrance that required careful attention, even in good conditions. As night hauler approached jetty, Jasper noticed lights marking entrance seemed to be moving, not swaying in wind or current, but actually shifting position, sliding along jetty structure as though they were not fixed in place. Jasper reduced speed and watched lights carefully, trying to determine if what he was seeing was real or another manifestation of whatever was affecting his perception tonight. The lights continued their slow movement, advancing and retreating along jetty in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like signals being sent in code he couldn't read. Jasper brought night hauler through entrance and into calm water of harbour basin. The moment he crossed threshold between ocean and harbour, everything returned to normal. Engine temperature gauge dropped to correct reading. Compass swung around to show true north. Stars, when he looked up at them, were arranged in their proper patterns. Orion rising in east, exactly where it should be at this time of night. Lighthouse at Point Pinos, visible now from this position, was flashing at 10-second intervals, its rhythm as reliable and correct as it had always been. Whistling sound from engine was gone completely, as though it had never existed. Jasper sat in his pilot's chair and felt adrenaline draining from his system, leaving him weak and shaking. Hattie Lavelle was waiting at dock when Jasper tied up, accompanied by 2 EMTs who had come in ambulance that sat with its lights off in parking lot. Hattie climbed aboard night hauler and asked Jasper how he was feeling, her concern genuine, but her expression showing clearly she expected to find someone in medical distress. Jasper told her he was fine, that everything was fine now, that whatever had been happening out there had stopped the moment he entered harbour. Hattie insisted he let EMTs check his vital signs. Jasper complied, submitting to their examination while trying to organize his thoughts into something that would sound rational when he attempted to explain. EMTs found nothing wrong. Jasper's blood pressure was slightly elevated, consistent with stress, but otherwise, vital signs were normal. They asked standard questions designed to assess his mental state and found his responses appropriate and coherent. They recommended he get rest and suggested he see his regular physician for follow-up evaluation, but saw no reason for emergency medical intervention. After they left, Hattie sat with Jasper in Wheelhouse and asked him to describe exactly what he'd experienced. Jasper went through an entire sequence of events, from incorrect current drift to temperature fluctuations to stars being wrong. Hattie listened without interrupting, making notes on pads she'd brought with her. When Jasper finished, Hattie was quiet for several minutes. Then she told him something that made all unease and fear return immediately. She said Jasper was the third fisherman to report similar experiences in this area over past 2 months. 2 other boats had called in with complaints about navigational anomalies, current flow that didn't match predictions, lighthouse timing that seemed off. Both of those fishermen had been evaluated by medical personnel and found to be in good health. Both had refused to work those waters again after their experiences. Hattie had been trying to find rational explanations, had consulted with oceanographers and Coast Guard officials, but no one could provide theories that adequately accounted for what was being reported. Official position was that fishermen were experiencing stress-related perceptual distortions, that long hours and isolation of night fishing were creating conditions where normal phenomena were being misinterpreted. Jasper asked Hattie what she personally believed. She looked at him for a long moment before responding. She said she'd been studying ocean conditions for 23 years, and in all that time she'd learned ocean still held mysteries science hadn't explained. There were areas where instruments malfunctioned for reasons no one understood. There were currents that appeared and disappeared without connection to any known forcing mechanism. There were phenomena fishermen reported but which could never be documented because they occurred in places and times where scientific equipment wasn't present to record them. Hattie believed something unusual was happening in waters off Moss Landing, something that affected navigation and perception in ways current scientific models couldn't account for. She didn't know what that something was, and she wasn't sure anyone would ever know, but she believed Jasper when he said what he'd experienced was real, not imagined. Jasper didn't go back out that night. He offloaded his catch, secured his boat, drove home to a house that felt strange and unfamiliar after what he'd witnessed on water. He lay in bed watching his ceiling and thinking about stars in wrong positions, about compasses pointing to false norths, about lighthouses that operated at impossible speeds. He thought about other 2 fishermen who had reported similar experiences and who had refused to return to those waters. He wondered if he would return, if need to make a living would overcome fear that had settled into his bones like cold seeping through damp clothing. Over following weeks, Jasper talked to other fishermen who had reported anomalies. They shared stories that were remarkably consistent, describing same types of navigational confusion, same instrument malfunctions, same sense that physical laws were being violated in subtle but unmistakable ways. None of them could explain what they'd experienced, and all of them had been told by officials they were mistaken, that their observations were product of fatigue or stress or equipment failure. But they knew what they'd seen, knew what their instruments had shown them, and they couldn't reconcile those observations with explanations being offered. They formed informal group, meeting occasionally to share information and support, understanding they were only ones who would believe each other's accounts. Jasper eventually returned to fishing, but he altered his patterns, working grounds that were farther from area where he'd experienced anomalies. He talked to Hattie Lavelle regularly, reporting any unusual observations and asking about reports from other vessels. Hattie maintained her own log of these incidents, documenting them carefully, even though she knew official channels wouldn't take them seriously. She believed eventually with enough data patterns would emerge that would point toward explanations. Until then, she did what she could to help Fisherman navigate safely and to document evidence of whatever was happening in those waters. Point Pinos Lighthouse continues to flash at 10-second intervals, its mechanism reliable and consistent, operating exactly as it has for more than a century. Tide tables continue to predict southward current flow along central California coast during falling tides, and instruments confirm those predictions with data that supports established oceanographic models. The stars remain in their proper positions, wheeling across sky in patterns that have guided navigation since humans first went to sea. Everything functions normally, operates according to known physical laws, conforms to scientific expectation. But Jasper Sloan knows differently. He knows that sometimes on certain nights, under conditions that cannot be predicted or controlled, the ocean becomes something else. A place where instruments lie and stars rearrange themselves and current flows in directions it should not go. And he knows that when that happens, the only safe choice is to return to harbor and wait for ocean to become normal again, to wait for whatever strange force temporarily inhabits those waters to release its grip and allow reality to resume its proper function.